There is a plant sitting in a nursery right now that garden centers do not want you to know about. It survives 3 weeks without water, it comes back every single spring even after a brutal winter, and it grows just as happily crammed into a cheap plastic pot on an apartment balcony as it does in a fancy backyard bed. Most people walk right past it because it looks a little plain in the 6-inch pot at the store. Then they take it home, forget about it for a month, and come back to find it bigger and healthier than ever. That is not luck. That is what a true lazy perennial does. And today, you are going to meet 12 of them. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 12 perennials that thrive in containers with almost zero maintenance. No daily watering, no constant fertilizing, no babysitting. I'm going to tell you exactly how deep to plant them, how often to actually water them, and which ones can survive total neglect. Number 9 on this list is the one most gardeners get completely wrong, and once you hear why, it might change the way you plant containers forever. Before we get into the list, I want to ask you for one small thing. If you have ever bought a plant, babied it for 2 weeks, and then watched it die anyway, you are going to want to see every item on this list, because I'm also going to tell you the one watering mistake that kills most container perennials before they even get established. If that sounds like something you need, hit subscribe now so you don't miss it, because I cover a different neglect-proof plant setup almost every week, and you don't want to be scrolling later trying to find this channel again. Item 1. Sedum, stonecrop. Sedum is probably the single most forgiving perennial you can put in a pot. It's a succulent, which means it stores water in its thick, fleshy leaves, so it barely needs you at all once it settles in. You can go 2 to 3 weeks without watering it in most climates and it won't even flinch. It thrives in full sun, tolerates poor soil, and actually performs worse if you fuss over it with rich soil and frequent feeding. Plant it in a container with drainage holes and a gritty, well-draining mix, something like a cactus blend, or regular potting soil mixed with perlite. Sedum spreads low and mounding if you choose a variety like dragon's blood, or it grows upright and clumping if you choose autumn joy, which produces broccoli-shaped flower heads that turn a deep rusty pink in fall and stay attractive well into winter. Here's the fact most people don't know. Sedum is one of the only perennials that actually gets healthier when you underwater it slightly. Overwatering is the #1 killer of container sedum, not underwatering. If the leaves start looking mushy or translucent, that's root rot from too much water, not a sign it needs more. But sedum is easy mode. The next plant on this list is even tougher, and it can survive a full growing season with almost no attention at all. Item 2. Russian sage. Russian sage looks incredibly delicate with its silvery stems and wispy lavender blue flowers, but do not let the appearance fool you. This plant is closer to a weed in terms of toughness. It is drought-tolerant once established, it loves poor rocky soil, and it actually flowers better when you neglect it, because rich soil and heavy watering cause it to flop over and produce fewer blooms. In a container, give it the biggest pot you can manage, at least 16 inches wide, because Russian sage develops a substantial root system and wants room to breathe. Full sun is non-negotiable here. This plant will sulk in shade and barely bloom. Once it is established, usually after the first full season, you can basically ignore it, except for a hard cutback in early spring, cutting the woody stems down to about 6 inches to encourage fresh growth. The surprising fact here is that Russian sage is technically a subshrub, not a true herbaceous perennial, which is part of why it handles drought so well. It has semi-woody stems that store more resources than soft-stemmed plants, so it bounces back from neglect that would kill other flowering perennials outright. If you thought that was tough, wait until you hear about the plant coming up next, because it is one of the only perennials on this list that thrives in shade, not sun, and most people plant it in the wrong spot completely. Item 3. Hosta. Hosta is the container plant for anyone who has a shady porch, a covered patio, or a balcony that barely gets direct sun. While most perennials demand 6 or more hours of sunlight, hosta actually prefers filtered light or partial shade, and too much direct afternoon sun will scorch its broad leaves. This makes it perfect for the exact spots where other container plants struggle. Choose a container with good drainage and a rich, moisture-retentive potting mix, since hosta likes consistent moisture more than the drought-tolerant plants earlier on in this list. That said, established hosta in a decent-sized pot, at least 12 inches deep, can go a week or more without water, without any visible stress. The leaves come in incredible variety, from tiny blue-green miniatures to massive golden variegated types that can fill a whole container on their own. Quick question for you. Which of these first three have you actually tried growing before? Sedum, Russian sage, or hosta? Type the name in the comments right now. I genuinely read every single one, and I want to know which of these is already sitting on your patio. And if you're finding this useful so far, tap subscribe, because the plants coming up in the second half of this list are even lower maintenance, including one that survives being forgotten in a garage over winter.
Item 4. Daylily. Daylily earns its nickname as the perfect plant for lazy gardeners, honestly. It tolerates poor soil, inconsistent watering, blazing heat, and light frost, and it still comes back with a flush of trumpet-shaped blooms every single summer. In a container, choose a variety labeled as compact or dwarf, since some daylily types can get quite large, but even full-sized ones adapt surprisingly well to pot life if the container is deep enough, ideally 14 inches or more. Daylilies form thick, fibrous root systems called crowns, and this is actually the secret to their toughness. That root mass stores enormous amounts of energy, which is why the plant can survive being nearly bone dry for over a week and still push out fresh blooms once you finally water it. Each individual flower only lasts one day, which is where the name comes from, but a healthy plant produces so many buds that you get weeks of continuous color. The fact most gardeners miss is that daylilies actually benefit from being slightly pot-bound. Unlike many perennials that need frequent repotting, daylilies flower more heavily when their roots are a little crowded, so you can leave them in the same container for 2 or 3 years before you need to divide them. Coming up next is a plant that most people assume needs constant deadheading and fussing, but in reality, it might be the most self-sufficient bloomer on this entire list. Item 5. Coreopsis. Coreopsis, sometimes called tickseed, produces a non-stop wave of small daisy-like yellow or bicolor flowers from early summer straight through fall, and it does this with almost no input from you. It thrives in poor, dry soil, actually struggles in rich, overly fertile soil, and handles container life beautifully because it does not demand deep root space. A 10 to 12 inch pot with regular potting mix and a sunny spot is really all Coreopsis needs. Water it deeply when the soil is completely dry, then leave it alone. This plant is native to many parts of North America, which is part of why it handles the swings between drought and sudden rain so well. It evolved for exactly that kind of unpredictable weather. Here's something most people never realize. Some Coreopsis varieties are technically short-lived perennials that only last 2 to 3 years, but they reseed so readily that new plants pop up to replace the old ones, which means your container often stays full of Coreopsis for years, even though no single plant lived that long. Item 6 is where things get interesting, because this next plant can survive something that would kill almost everything else on this list, being completely forgotten in a dark garage for the entire winter. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever killed a plant simply because you were too busy to water it? Be honest in the comments, because I promise you are not alone, and the next few plants on this list are specifically for people who travel a lot or just do not have time for daily plant care. If that describes you even a little, subscribe now so you catch the rest of this series, because next week I'm covering the exact potting mix recipe that makes any perennial more drought resistant. Item 6. Daylily's cousin, the hardy hibiscus. Hardy hibiscus is not related to tropical hibiscus, and that distinction matters enormously for container gardeners. This plant is a true perennial that dies back to the ground every winter and returns each spring, and it can survive being left in an unheated garage or shed through the coldest months without any special care. In containers, it produces dinner plate-sized flowers, sometimes 8 to 12 inches across, in shades of deep red, pink, and white. Give hardy hibiscus a large container, at least 18 inches wide, because it grows into a substantial plant, sometimes 3 to 5 feet tall, even in a pot. It wants full sun and consistent moisture during the growing season. But once it goes dormant in fall, you can genuinely ignore it completely until spring. Many gardeners simply move the pot into an unheated garage and forget about it until the weather warms. The surprising fact here is that hardy hibiscus is one of the last perennials to emerge in spring, often not showing any green growth until late May, even when everything else in your garden is already blooming. This leads many gardeners to think the plant died and toss it out too early, when in reality, it just has a slower internal clock. The next plant is one you have probably seen growing wild along highways, and it turns out that same toughness translates perfectly into container life. Item 7, Black-Eyed Susan. Black-Eyed Susan is the classic golden yellow flower with the dark chocolate brown center that you see thriving in ditches, meadows, and roadside strips all over the country. And that is exactly the point. If it can survive exhaust fumes, road salt, and zero irrigation on the side of a highway, it will absolutely thrive in a container on your patio with minimal effort from you. In a pot, Black-Eyed Susan wants full sun and average potting soil, nothing special. It tolerates both drought and occasional overwatering better than most perennials, which makes it incredibly forgiving for beginners. A 12-inch container is plenty, and this plant often blooms the very first summer from a small starter plant, giving you fast results without years of waiting. What most people do not know is that Black-Eyed Susan is a magnet for pollinators, specifically because of that dark central cone, which is actually made up of hundreds of tiny individual flowers packed together. Bees and butterflies can access nectar from dozens of blooms in one visit, which is part of why gardens with Black-Eyed Susan tend to buzz with activity all summer long. Number 8 is a plant that most people think only grows well in the ground, but it turns out container life might actually suit it better.
Item 8, Catmint. Related but distinct from catnip, produces soft lavender blue flower spikes over silvery green foliage, and it is remarkably drought-tolerant once established. It thrives in poor, dry soil and actually blooms more reliably in a container than in rich garden soil because containers naturally drain faster and prevent the soggy conditions catmint dislikes. Plant it in a container with excellent drainage, add extra perlite or coarse sand to your potting mix if you can, and place it in full sun. Catmint has a sprawling, slightly floppy growth habit that looks beautiful cascading over the edge of a pot. When it starts to look tired mid-summer, a quick trim, cutting it back by about a third, triggers a fresh flush of blooms within a couple of weeks with zero other effort required. The fact that surprises most people is that catmint genuinely does attract cats the same way catnip does, though usually less intensely. So if you have an outdoor cat, do not be shocked if you find your container getting rolled in or nibbled on occasionally. It is completely harmless to the plant's long-term health. Item 9 is the one I mentioned at the very start of this video, and it might be the most misunderstood plant on this entire list. Item 9, Lavender. Here is the mistake almost everyone makes with lavender in containers. They treat it like a normal flowering plant and water it on a regular schedule. Lavender actually wants to dry out almost completely between waterings, and the single biggest reason container lavender dies is not cold, not neglect. It is overwatering combined with soil that holds too much moisture. The fix is simple. Use a gritty, fast-draining mix, something close to a cactus or succulent blend, and choose a terracotta pot instead of plastic if possible, because terracotta is porous and wicks excess moisture away from the roots. Place it in the sunniest spot you have. Lavender wants at minimum 6 hours of direct sun and thrives with even more. Once you get the soil and sun right, lavender becomes one of the lowest maintenance plants you can own, often going a week or two between waterings even in summer heat. Most people do not realize that lavender is actually native to rocky Mediterranean hillsides, essentially poor, dry, sun-baked terrain, so every instinct you have to give it rich soil and frequent water is working directly against how this plant evolved to survive. Once you stop treating it like a delicate flower and start treating it like the tough Mediterranean shrub it actually is, it becomes nearly impossible to kill. Number 10 brings us to a plant that somehow manages to look tropical and exotic while being just as tough as everything we have covered so far. Quick pause here. I want you to comment your city or growing zone below because I'm genuinely curious how many different climates are watching this right now and whether these plants hold up the same way everywhere.
I read every single comment, so do not be shy. Even a one-word answer helps me understand who is actually watching this series. Item 10 is yucca. Yucca brings serious architectural drama to a container with its sword-shaped, sometimes variegated leaves, and it might be the most drought-tolerant plant on this entire list. In its native desert and dry plains habitat, yucca can go months without meaningful rainfall, so a missed watering in your backyard is nothing to this plant at all. Choose a container with excellent drainage. This is non-negotiable for yucca, since standing water will rot the roots faster than almost anything else can kill it. A gritty cactus-style mix works perfectly. Full sun is ideal, though yucca tolerates partial shade better than most desert plants. Just expect slower growth and fewer of the tall white flower spikes it occasionally sends up. The surprising fact here is that yucca has a deeply symbiotic relationship with a specific species of moth in the wild called the yucca moth, which is the only pollinator capable of fertilizing its flowers. In a home container, this relationship rarely comes into play since you are not relying on seed production, but it shows just how specialized and tough this plant is, having evolved a pollination system found almost nowhere else in nature. Item 11 is a plant most people only associate with herb gardens, but its perennial toughness makes it a fantastic no-fuss container choice too. Item 11, thyme. Thyme is technically an herb, but it behaves exactly like a tough, low-growing perennial in containers, and it might be the most neglect-proof ground cover style plant you can grow. It spreads low and mat-like, tolerates poor rocky soil, and actually produces more concentrated flavor and stronger scent when it is grown a little drier and leaner rather than lush and well-fed. A shallow, wide container suits thyme well since its root system stays relatively shallow. Full sun and fast-draining soil are the two things that matter most. Once established, thyme can handle being nearly forgotten for a week or two at a time, especially in cooler weather, and it comes back reliably year after year even in regions with real winter cold, as long as the container itself does not freeze completely solid. What most people do not know is that creeping varieties of thyme, sometimes labeled as woolly thyme or elfin thyme, are tough enough to be walked on occasionally, which is why they are often used between stepping stones. That same toughness against foot traffic and compaction translates directly into toughness against a gardener who simply forgets to water for a while. And that brings us to the final plant on this list, one that might genuinely be the hardest perennial to kill that I have ever grown personally. Item 12, purple coneflower or echinacea. Purple coneflower closes out this list because it might be the single toughest flowering perennial available to home gardeners. It is drought-tolerant, heat-tolerant, cold-hardy, and shrugs off poor soil, all while producing large daisy-like purple-pink flowers with a distinctive raised orange center that blooms from early summer well into fall. In a container, coneflower wants a pot at least 12 to 14 inches deep to accommodate its long taproot, and full sun for the best bloom production. Water deeply but infrequently, letting the soil dry out between waterings, and resist the urge to deadhead every single spent flower, since the seed heads that form afterward provide food for goldfinches and other birds through fall and winter, adding a whole extra season of interest to a plant that is technically done blooming. The fact almost nobody knows is that echinacea gets its name from the Greek word for hedgehog, referring to the spiky, spiny center cone of the flower. And that same toughness at the genetic level is part of why this plant has been used in traditional herbal remedies for centuries. Whether or not you believe in its medicinal properties, there is no debate about its toughness as a container plant. It is about as close to indestructible as a flowering perennial gets. If you notice a pattern across all 12 of these plants, it is this. Every single one of them thrives on being left alone. They come from harsh backgrounds, rocky hillsides, dry prairies, roadsides, desert plains, and that harsh origin is exactly why they do not need you to fuss over them in a pot on your patio. The gardeners who struggle the most with containers are usually the ones trying the hardest, overwatering, overfeeding, and constantly checking on plants that just want to be left to do their own thing. The secret to a low-maintenance container garden is not finding more time to take care of your plants. It is choosing plants that were built to survive without you. If you want to take this even further, next week I'm breaking down the exact potting mix recipe that makes any perennial more drought-resistant, including the one ingredient most garden centers never tell you about. Make sure you're subscribed so that video lands right in your feed the moment it goes live. And before you go, drop a comment letting me know which of these 12 surprised you the most.
I read every single one, and I genuinely love seeing which plants you end up trying. Thanks for spending this time with me today. Now go give one of these a home in a pot, and then do yourself a favor and leave it alone. See you in the next one.